completely failed to create a structure so that it would continue after his death. And of course, he died young. He didn't think he would die when he did, but still, you should put something in place. So his was a flash in the pan. He had this spectacular conquest. In 10 years, he conquered what was then most of the known world, but he had no permanent structure in place. He didn't really deal with the issue of succession. It fell apart instantly. The Romans are much more about building a structure. So, I mean, as we talked about a little, they were very good about incorporating the people they conquered into the Roman project. I mean, they're oppressive, they're imperialistic as well. Let's not whitewash them. They had moments when they would just wipe out entire cities. But on the whole, they were much more about trying to bring people into the Roman world. And I think that was one of their strengths, is that they were open to integration and bringing in different people to keep rejuvenating themselves.
I think that's the strength.
One of the most influential developments from the Roman Republic was their legal system. And as you mentioned, it's one of the things that still lasted to this day in many of its elements. So it started with the 12 tables in 451 BC. Can you just speak to this legal system and the 12 tables?
Yeah, I mean, Roman law is one of their most significant, maybe the most significant legacy they have on the modern world. So, I mean, just to start at that end of it, something like 90% of the world uses a legal system which is either directly or indirectly derived from the Roman one. So even countries that you wouldn't think are really using Roman law kind of are, because all the terminology, all that comes from Roman law. And the Romans, their first law code was this thing, the 12 tables. So this is way back in the Middle Republic, and it was a typical early law code. So most of the stuff are agricultural concerns. So if I have a tree and its fruit drops onto your property, who owns the fruit? Yeah. If my cow wanders into your field and eats your grain, am I responsible? I mean, I love these early law codes that are all about this, like, farmer problems, But law codes are hugely important because you need a law code to enable people to live in groups. So they're the transitional thing that lets human beings live together without just resorting to anarchy. And most of the early law codes are agricultural, like Hammurabi's code in Mesopotamia. Most of them are retaliatory, meaning eye for an eye type justice. So you do something to me, it gets done to you. But they're this necessary precondition for civilization, I would say. And the 12 tables is that. It's a crude law code. It has a lot of goofy stuff in it. It has things about, if you use magic, this is the punishment. But it's that basic agrarian society law code. Now, that's typical of many societies. Where the Romans are different is they keep going. They keep developing their law code. And by the late Republic, the Romans just get kind of really into legal stuff. I don't know why, but and the Romans are very methodical, organized people, so maybe this has something to do with it. But their law code just keeps getting more and more complicated and keeps expanding to different areas. And they start to get jurists who write sort of theoretical things about Roman law. And eventually it becomes this huge body both of cases and comments on those cases and of actual laws. And in the 6th century AD, so the 500s, the Roman Emperor Justinian, who is a emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire by this point, the Byzantine Empire, compiles all this together into something that today we just kind of loosely call Justinian's Code of Roman Law, and that survives. And so that becomes the basis for almost all the legal systems around the world, and it's very complicated. And Roman law, I think, is really fun, because on the one hand, it's really dry, but it also preserves these wonderful little vignettes of daily life. So you get these great, just kind of entertaining law cases. One of my favorite, and this may not even be a real case, this might be a hypothetical that they would use like to train Roman sort of, law students, is like, one day a man sends his slave to the barber to get a shave. And the barber shop is adjacent to an athletic field. And two guys are on the athletic field throwing a ball back and forth. And one of them throws the ball badly. The other guy fails to catch it. The ball flies into the barber shop, hits the hand of the barber, cuts the slave's throat, he dies. Who's liable under Roman law? Is it the athlete 1 who threw the ball badly? Is it athlete 2 who failed to catch it? Is the barber who actually cut the slave's throat? Is it the owner of the slave for being stupid enough to send his slave to get a shave in a place adjacent to a playing field? Or is it the Roman state for zoning a barber shop next to an athletic field? What do you think?
Well, do they resolve the complexity of that with a right answer?
We don't have the answer.
We don't have the
It's
answer.
it's a case without the answer. So we have various jurists commenting on this one, but we don't have what was actually
That's it.
ruled.
That's
But it's just a great little, sort of vignette. And that's how complicated Roman law got, that it was dealing with these weird esoteric questions. There's another one where, a cow gets loose and runs into an apartment building, goes up onto the roof and crashes down 3 stories into a bar on the ground floor and kicks open the taps to the wine jug, and all the wine flows out. Who's at fault? I mean, this seems to have happened, as crazy as it sounds. And Roman testamentary law is great. I mean, something like 20% of Roman law has to do with wills and what you do with a will and what makes a will valid. You have to have
Sorry
7
about that.
witnesses, and you have to have a guy named a Liebeprens to witness it, and the witnesses have to be adult men who can't be blind, and all this other stuff. So it's just great. I mean, it's fun to mess around in this, but it always contains these little nuggets about what happens. I mentioned I wrote a book on floods, and there were all these law cases about if a flood strikes the city and picks up my piece of furniture in my apartment building and carries it out the door and deposits it in another apartment building, does that guy now own my furniture because it's now legally within his apartment? Or can I go in there and repossess it because the flood took it out of my apartment? This is the stuff laws handle, and that's how sophisticated Roman law got.
Did kind of corrupt, unfair things seep into the law?
Oh yeah, I mean it's biased in favor of the wealthy, obviously. And I mean, Roman law cases are interesting because they became linked to politics. So one of the way that politicians, up and coming politicians, aspiring politicians, could sort of make their name or become famous was by either prosecuting or defending people in Roman law courts. And especially during the late Roman Republic, you get a lot of really sensational, what today we'd call celebrity law cases. So this is where some of the biggest politicians were accused of very melodramatic kinds of things. I mean, the most famous Roman orator of all time, Cicero, is a guy who made his entire career in the law courts, and that's how he made his reputation, was able to parlay that into political power, and eventually was elected to the highest office in the Roman government. But it's purely because of his skill, his facility at using
As an
words,
orator.
at giving speeches in public.
So they loved the puzzle and the game of law, the sort of untangling really complicated legal situations and coming up with new laws that help you tangle and untangle
Yes,
the situations.
and law cases, again, especially in the late Republic, also became a form of public spectacle.
Right.
So Rome did not have law courts in a building locked away. A lot of these cases were held in the Roman Forum, in the open, and audiences would just come to be entertained. And the people presenting the speeches there were playing as much to this audience as they were to, let's say, the jury or a judge. And that became a big part of the cases. So that's all tied up in Roman oratory
So
too.
we're talking a bit about the details of the laws. Is there some big picture laws that are new innovations or like profound things like all Roman citizens are equal before the law, kind of founding fathers type of in the United States, in the Western world, these big legal ideas?
I think maybe one of the things that was really stressed in Roman law early on, even as early as the 12 Tables, is the notion of Roman citizenship. So if you were a Roman citizen,
You got
came with a
special
set
things.
of, both privileges,
privileges
and obligations.
and obligations.
So
Yeah.
the obligations were you're supposed to fight in the army.
America's
you're
the
supposed to
same.
vote in
Yep.
elections. The privileges were you had the protection of Roman law, and at least in theory, if not in practice, everybody was equal under that law. Now, of course, keep in mind we're talking about men here. And even at the height of the Roman Empire, so let's say 2nd century AD, there were about 50 million human beings living within the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Maybe 6 million were actual citizens. So, this is, we tend to go, oh, it's so great. If you're a citizen, you have all these things. Well, adult, free men who are not slaves, who are not resident foreigners, they have this great stuff. And that's always a tiny minority of all the human beings who existed in this society. But still, the notion of citizenship is huge. And citizens, for example, early on, you had to be tried at Rome if you were accused of something. And there's this very famous moment in Sicily where an abusive governor who's corrupt is punishing a citizen arbitrarily, and this person cries out "Civis Romanus sum," meaning "I am a Roman citizen." And it really was this hugely loaded statement that gives me protections. It is wrong for you to do this to me. It's wrong for you to beat me because I am a citizen, and that gives me certain protections. So that notion
That's
of
how I felt
citizenship is
about.
something that I think.
That's how I felt about the Denver police and the way they treated me, and their courts. I was like, I am a citizen. I should not have been treated this way over drugs. I'm just a kid, and it was terrible. And so now I hate them, and I wish to destroy them. I don't wish to destroy them, but I have no respect for them.
The Romans really emphasized and becomes a legacy to a lot of civilizations today, where citizenship means something. It's a special status.
So you mentioned slavery. That's something that is common throughout human history. What do we know about their relationship with slavery?
Well, Roman slavery, a couple just reminders at the beginning. First of all, it's not racial slavery. So for people, in the United States, you tend to think of slavery through this kind of racial lens. So slaves in ancient Roman society could be any color, ethnicity, gender, origin, whatever. It's an economic status. Now, having said that, slavery is fundamentally horrific to human dignity because it is defining a human being as an object. And very famously, a Roman agricultural writer who's writing about farms, just as a kind of aside, says, on your farm you have three types of tools. You have dumb tools, and by dumb he means can't speak. So that's like shovels, picks, things like this, wagons. You have semi-articulate tools, which are animals, and you have articulate tools, which are human beings, slaves. And for him, these are all just categories of tools. It's so intensely dehumanizing to view people in that way. So Roman slavery is odd in that it doesn't have this racial component. It's horrible in the way all slavery is horrible. But the other thing about it is it's not a hard line. It's a permeable membrane, and many people move back and forth across it. So you have many people in the Roman world who were born a slave who gained their freedom through one means or another. And you have many others who were born free and become slaves. And you have some who go back and forth. There's a great Roman tombstone of this guy who says, I was born a free man in Parthia, I was enslaved, then I gained my freedom and I became a teacher or something, and I had a life, and now I'm a Roman citizen. So it's this whole back and forth across all these boundaries multiple times.
Oh, so there's probably a process, like an economic transaction.
The most common source of slaves in the Roman world was war. So wherever the Roman army went, in its wake would be literally a train of slave traders. So you're in war, you capture an enemy city, you whack the people over the head, and you turn around if you're a soldier and you sell them to one of these slave traders that's following the army around, literally.
Oh my god.
So that's probably the biggest source of slaves. Another big source is just children of slaves or slaves. And some people could literally sell either themselves or their children into slavery due to economic, necessity or privation or something. So as terrible as that sounds, a father could sell a child if he needed money. Once you were a slave, though, the experience of slavery varied a lot because a lot of the slaves were agricultural slaves. So they would work sort of like in the American South, big plantations. They might be chained. They were probably abused. That's very similar to slavery as we think of it in, let's say the Caribbean, South America, or the United States prior to the Civil War, that kind of slavery. But a lot of Roman slaves were also some of the more skilled people. And this seems a little weird. So if you're a rich person, you have slaves, it's actually a good investment for you to train your slaves in a profession. So a lot of Roman doctors, scribes, accountants, sort of, all this sort of thing, barbers were slaves.
The lower class.
Because if you train this person and then they produce a lot of...
Yep. Like the lower class in America. Yep. Basically serf slaves, We work for low wages as opposed to the chain whip on our back. freedom was a pretty good lie. But when it comes to actually thriving and being happy and having enough, I'm not so sure. I think we'll see. Quite a good dose of protein.
For you, you get that money. And those slaves would sometimes be given an incentive to work hard where they could, and this is just sort of an agreement between the master and the slave, if they earned a certain amount of money, X amount of money, they could then buy their own freedom from the master. So this was your incentive to work harder. If you were trained, let's say, as a doctor, I work really hard, I can buy myself out of slavery. Or a lot of masters would free their slaves in their wills. So when they died, they would say, I manumit this slave and that slave. So it was a weird institution in that it was, elements were just as horrible as what we think of as slavery and just as exploitative. And it, like I say, the overall notion of slavery is intensely dehumanizing. But yet there was this wide range of types of slaves. And the odd thing is, in the city of Rome, many of the worst jobs, so if you're, just a laborer hauling crap around, at the docks or, things like that, you might well be a free person, and a slave would hold a skilled job. And that seems a little strange or counterintuitive to us, but you see how in the Roman economy it sort of works.
And that could be one of the things that would be surprising to us coming from the modern day to the ancient world, is just the number of slaves. So you mentioned one of the things we don't think about is that most of the people are farmers.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is just the number of slaves.
And there's a big debate, how many slaves were there? What percentage of the populace, let's say in the city of Rome, were slaves? And this is something historians like to argue about a lot. And we keep coming back to this theme of, sometimes it's the little things that illustrate stuff well. And for slaves, the one that always gets me is some slaves, and these would be sort of the more abused slaves, they would literally put little bronze collars on them with a tag that said, hi, my name is Felix. I'm the slave of so-and-so. I've run away. If you catch me, return me to the temple of so-and-so and you'll get a reward. So it's a dog tag, right? Except this is a human being. And you can see these in museums. I mean, you can go to a museum today and see this little bronze collar with a tag on it that's talking about a human being as if they're this kind of animal that's run away. And this is very telling too. We're talking about Roman law. Under Roman law, technically, when a slave runs away, the crime that he's committing is theft.
Yep.
Because he's stolen himself from his master. So again, it's this very dehumanizing view of it.
And just a reminder to people in America thinking about this, we have a certain view and picture to what slavery is. A reminder that all of human history, most of human history, has had slaves of all colors, of all religions. That's within us, to select a group of people, call them the other, use them as objects, abuse them. And I would say, as a person who believes the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, all of us, every person listening to this, is capable of being owner of a slave if they're put in the position, of capable of hating the other, of forming the other, of othering other people. And we should be very careful not to look ourselves in the mirror and remind ourselves that we're human. It's easy to kind of think, okay, well, there's these slaves and slave owners through history, and I would have never been one of those. But just like as we would be farmers, We could be both. If went back into history, we could be both slaves and slave owners, and all of those are humans.
I mean, just to build on that, I'd say the othering of others is a morally corrosive thing to do.
Uh, so this fascinating transition between the Republic to the Empire. You want to talk about that? How does the Republic fall?
Oh boy. Okay, so the Roman Republic, on the one hand, is incredibly successful. Right? In a short period of time, it's expanded wildly. It's conquered the Mediterranean world. It's gained tons of wealth. The contradiction here is that Rome's very success has made almost every group within Roman society deeply unhappy and boiling with resentment. So this is the contradiction. Enormous success on the surface, you end up with this boiling pot of resentment and unhappiness. So let's break this down. Who's unhappy? Well, the people fighting Rome's wars. The common farmers who went off to fight. They joined the army, they went and fought, they've come back, they've seen Rome get wealthy, they've seen their generals get wealthy, they've conquered all these areas, all this money and stuff is flowing back to Rome, but when they're discharged from the army, they don't get that much. So they feel like, I spent the best years of my life fighting for my country, I deserve a reward, I haven't gotten it. So you have a lot of veterans who are now unemployed or underemployed. Many of them have sold their small family farms when they went off to join the army, and now they don't have them. So that group's unhappy, the veterans. You have the aristocrats, who on the surface, the ones who are doing well, they're the politicians and the generals. But as time goes on, the ones who get the plum appointments, who get the good generalships, starts coming from a smaller and smaller subset of the aristocrats. The Scipios and their friends start to dominate. So you end up where most of the aristocratic class is feeling, hey, I'm left out. I didn't get what I deserved. What about the half-citizens and the allies, the Italians, who have fought for Rome, who stayed loyal when Hannibal invaded? They didn't go over to his side. Well, they feel, rightfully, we stayed loyal to Rome, we fought for them, we deserve our reward, we should be full citizens. But the Romans are traditional, they're conservative, they don't like change, they don't give them that. What about all the slaves? Well, they've conquered all these foreigners, they've sold them, now many of them are working these plantations, big plantations owned by rich people that used to be little family farms. The slaves are obviously unhappy. So you end up with a society where it's incredibly successful by about 100 BC, but almost every group that composes it feels like, I haven't shared in the benefits of what's happened, or I've been exploited by it. So they all end up intensely unhappy. And the next 100-year period, from 133 to 31 BC, is called the Late Roman Republic, and it's a time of nearly constant internal strife, ultimately culminating in multiple rounds of civil war. So Roman society literally breaks apart, turns on itself, and goes to war with itself over not equitably sharing the benefits of conquest and of empire. So it's a lesson about not sharing the benefits of something in a society, but concentrating it in one little group. And the other thing that happens is, among the aristocrats, they start to get more and more ambitious. So in the past, there was a lot of ideology of the state is more important than the person. If you were a little Roman kid, you would have been told these stories of Roman heroes, and they're all about self-sacrifice, putting the state before you, about modesty, about these sort of, values. Well, by the late Republic, you have a succession of strong men. And it is a chain. So it goes, Marius, Sully, Pompey, Julius Caesar, where each one pushes the boundaries of the Roman Republic a little bit, pushes at the structures of the institutions of the Republic, and they're motivated by personal gain. They're putting themselves above the state. So at the same time, you have lots of groups unhappy in society, and you get these strong men who are now undermining the institutions, chipping away at the things that have been shared, things holding the state together. And in the end, they just become so ambitious, they're like, I don't care about the state, I'm going to try and make myself ruler of Rome. So, this is going to culminate obviously in Julius Caesar, who does succeed in making himself dictator for life of the Roman Republic, which is tantamount to king, and he gets assassinated for it, but he's the end point of this progression of people who really undermine the institutions of the Republic through their own personal greed.
So the resentment boils and boils and boils, and there's this person that puts themselves
And they
above
exploit it. They're demagogues.
Yeah.
They exploit it.
but Caesar puts himself above the state, and that, I guess, the Roman people also hate.
Well, I mean, it's a love-hate because Caesar is very successful at playing to the Roman people. So he becomes their hero where he says, I'll be your champion against the state who doesn't care about you. So Caesar will do things where he'll put on big shows for the people. And it's cynical. I mean, he's doing this to further his own political power, but he's presenting himself as a populist in essence, even though he aspires to be a dictator, right? But it's a way of winning the people's support because that's a tool for him in his struggle with other aristocrats.
So a dictator in populist clothing.
Yes.
But he gets
When convenient. Other times he'll play to the aristocracy.
and when he gets assassinated, another civil war explodes.
That's an interesting moment because all these things have been leading up to Caesar, and it really is a chain of men. So it starts with this guy Marius, who is one of the first to start making armies loyal to him rather than to the state. That's a step in the wrong direction, right? The army should be loyal to the state, not to an individual general. They shouldn't look for him to rewards. Marius kind of breaks that, makes a precedent. One of his proteges is a guy named Sulla. Sulla comes along, and he ends up marching on Rome with his army and taking it over. And he says, well, I'm just doing it for the good of the state. But that's another precedent. Now you've had someone attacking their own capital city, even if they say they're doing it for the right reasons. Then Pompey comes along, and Pompey just breaks all kinds of things. He starts holding offices when he's too young to do so. He raises personal armies from his own wealth. He disobeys commands. He manipulates commands. He does all kinds of stuff. But in the end, he sides with the Senate when sort of forced. And finally, Caesar comes along, and Caesar just shamelessly, no, it's about me. I'm going to push it. And he is the one who wins a civil war against the state and Pompey, takes over Rome, and says, now I'm going to be dictator. And dictator is a traditional office in the Roman state, but dictators were limited to no more than 6 months of power. And Caesar says, well, I'll be dictator for life, which, of course, is king. He gets killed for it. So Caesar succeeded in taking over the state as one man, but he couldn't solve the problem. How do you rule Rome as one person and not get killed for looking like a king? That's the dilemma, the riddle that Caesar leaves behind him. He did it. He seized power as one guy, but how do you stay alive? How do you come up with something that the people will accept? And Caesar did some other things which are bad. He was arrogant. He didn't even pretend that the Senate were his equals. He just kind of, railroaded them around. He didn't respect them. He named a month after himself, July, Julius. He did egotistical things. So that pissed people off. They didn't like it. And when Caesar dies, it's this interesting moment. The Republic's sort of dead by then. You're gonna have a hard time reviving it. You've broken too many precedents. But there's a power vacuum now. Caesar's gone. What's gonna happen next? And you have a whole group of people who want to be the next Caesar. So the most obvious is Mark Antony, who is Caesar's right-hand man, his lieutenant. He's a very good general. He's very charismatic. Everybody kind of expects Mark Antony to just become the next Caesar. But there's also another of Caesar's lieutenants, a guy named Lepidus, sort of like Antony, but not quite as great as him. There's the Senate itself, which wants to reassert its power, kind of become the dominant force in Rome again. There's the assassins, who killed Caesar, led by Brutus and another guy, Cassius. They now want to seize control. And finally, there's a really weird dark horse candidate to fill this power vacuum, and that's Julius Caesar's grand nephew, who at the time is a 17-year-old kid named Octavian. Who cares? He's nobody. Absolutely nobody. But when Caesar's will is opened after his death, so posthumously read, in his will, Caesar posthumously, and this is a little weird, posthumously adopts Octavian as his son. Now again, who cares? Antony gets the troops, Antony gets the money, the other people get everything. What does Octavian get? He gets to now rename himself Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Who cares? Well, around the Mediterranean, there's about 12 legions full of hardened soldiers who are just kind of used to following a guy named Gaius Julius Caesar. And even though it's not quite logical, this 18-year-old, he's now 18-year-old kid, inherits an army overnight. So he becomes a player in this game for power. And the next 30, 40 years is going to be those groups all vying with one another. There's another candidate too, Pompey's son. Pompey was Caesar's great rival. He has a couple sons, and one of them, a guy named Sextus Pompey, basically becomes a warlord who seizes control of Sicily, one of the richest provinces, has a whole navy. He's vying to be one of these successors too. So for the next 40 years, it's, as you said, another civil war to see which guy emerges. Is it going to be the Senate? Is it going to be the assassins? Is it going to be Antony? Is it going to be Lepidus? Is it going to be Sextus Pompey? Is it going to be Octavian?
So now looking back at all that history, it just feels like history turns on so many interesting accidents, because Octavian, later renamed Augustus, turned out to be actually, depends how you define good, but a good king slash emperor, different than Caesar in terms of humility, at least being able to play, not to piss off everybody. But like, it could have been so many other people. It could that could have been the fall of Rome. So like, it's a fascinating little turn of history. Maybe Caesar saw something in this individual. It's not an accident that he was in the will.
Yeah, it's. I mean, Caesar clearly did see something in him, and Octavian, cut to the end, is the one who emerges from all that as the victor. We can talk about how he does it, but he's the one who sort of ends up in the same position as Caesar. It takes him 30 years, but he defeats all the foes. He's the sole guy. He now faces Caesar's riddle. How do you rule Rome as one guy and not get killed? And Octavian's, what makes him stand out, what makes him fascinating to me, is he wasn't a good general. In fact, he was a terrible general. He lost almost every battle he commanded. But what he is he's politically savvy, and he's very good at what today we would call manipulation of your public image and propaganda. So he basically defeats Mark Antony partially by waging a propaganda war against him. I mean, Antony starts out as a legitimate rival, and there are two Romans vying for power. At the end of this war, propaganda war, Octavian has managed to portray Antony as a foreign aggressor allied with an enemy king or queen, in this case Cleopatra, and who is an official enemy of the Roman state. And that's all propaganda. So he takes what's a civil war and makes it look like a war against a foreign enemy. And when Octavian becomes the sole ruler, he looks at what Caesar did wrong, and he very carefully avoids the same mistakes. So the first thing is just how he lives his life. He's very modest. He lives in an ordinary house like other aristocrats. He wears just a plain toga, nothing fancy. He's respectful to the Senate. He treats them with respect. He eats simple foods. I mean, he's someone who cared about the reality of power, not the external trappings. Clearly, there's some rulers who love, I want to dress in fancy clothes, I want to be surrounded by gold, everything. This is what makes me feel good. Octavian's the opposite. He doesn't care about any of that. He wants real power. And then the other thing is, how is he going to rule Rome without looking like a king? And his solution to this is brilliant. He basically pretends to resign from all his public offices. Not pretends, he does. So he holds no official office. But what he does is he manipulates so that the Roman Senate votes him the powers of the key Roman offices, but not the office itself. So the highest office in the Roman state is the consul. Consuls have the power to command armies, do all sorts of
Assistant
things.
to the regional manager.
Octavian gets voted the powers of a consul. So he can command armies, control meetings of the Senate, do all this. But he's not one of the two consuls elected for every year. So he's just kind of floating or drifting off to the side of the Roman government. He gets the power of a tribune, which has all sorts of powers. He can veto anything he wants, but he's not one of the tribunes elected for any 1 year. So the state, the republic, appears to continue as it always has. Each year they hold the same elections, they elect the same number of people. Notionally, those people are in charge. But floating off to the side, you have this guy Octavian, who has equivalent power not just to any one magistrate or official, but to all of them. So at any moment, he can just sort of pop up and say, no, let's not do this. Let's do something else. and he also keeps the army under his personal control.
Isn't this a fascinating story? Like, what do you think is the psychology of Augustus, of Octavian?
Yeah, and he later changed his name to Augustus when he sort of becomes first emperor. And the other thing he does is he hides his power behind all these different names. So, Caesar called himself dictator for life, right? So everybody knew what he was. Octavian, we even have a source that talks about it. It says he wondered what to call himself. Do I call myself king? No, can't do that. Dictator for life? No way. Maybe I'll call myself Romulus. That was the founder of Rome. No, Romulus was a king. And finally, a solution is he takes a bunch of titles which are all ambiguous, and no one of them sounds that impressive, but collectively they are. So, for example, one of the titles he gets is Augustus, which is something tied to Roman religion. Something that is Augustus in Latin has two possible meanings. One is someone who is Augustus is very pious. They respect the gods deeply. Well, that sounds nice, doesn't it? While on the other hand, an alternative meaning for Augustus is something that is itself divine. So is he just a deeply religious, pious person, or is he himself sacred? There's that ambiguity. He calls himself princeps, which means first citizen. Okay, what the hell does that mean? Am I a citizen just like everybody else, or am I the first citizen, which means I'm superior to all the others? So every title he takes has this weird ambiguity. He calls himself imperator, which is traditionally something that soldiers shout at a victorious general who's won a battle. And now he takes this as a permanent title. So it implies he's a good general. And by the way, it's from imperator that we get the word emperor, an empire. So originally it's a military title, a spontaneous military acclamation.
It's just fascinating that he figured out a way through public image, through branding, to gain power, maintain power, and still pacify the boiling turmoil that led to the civil wars.
Yeah. Well, two things I think work in his favor as well. One is he brings peace and stability. So by this point, the Romans have experienced 100 years almost of civil war and chaos. So at that point, your family, maybe you've had family members die in these wars or been proscribed, your property has been confiscated, who knows what. And here's a guy who brings peace and stability and doesn't seem oppressive or cruel or whatever. So you're like, okay, fine. I don't care. Maybe he's killed the Republic, but at least we're not dying in the streets anymore. So that's a big thing he does. And secondly, even though Augustus always seemed kind of sickly, his constitution, he lives forever. He rules for like 50 years. And by the time he dies, there's no one literally almost left alive who can remember the Republic. So at that point, by the time he dies, this is the only system we know.
That's another just fascinating accident of history, because as we talked about with Alexander the Great, who knows if he lived for another 40 years, if over time the people that hate the new thing die off and then their sons and come into power, that could be a very different story. Maybe we'll be talking about the Greek Empire.
That's a fluke of fate, but it's hugely influential in history.
You mentioned Cleopatra. If we go back to that, what role did she play? Another fascinating human being.
Cleopatra is interesting. I mean, she was a direct descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. When Alexander's empire had broken up, Ptolemy, this general, had seized control of Egypt, made it his kingdom. And she, 10 generations later, is a descendant of this Macedonian general. So Egypt had been ruled by, in essence, foreigners, these Macedonian dynasty of kings, and often they literally were ruled by the same dynasty because they had a habit of marrying brothers to sisters. And Cleopatra was, in fact, originally married to her younger brother. But despite that, she seems to have intensely identified with Egypt. In fact, she seems to have been the first one of all these Ptolemy kings who actually bothered to learn to speak Egyptian. So she seemed to really have cared about Egypt as well. And she was clearly very smart, very clever. And so she's living at a time during the late Republic, when Rome is having all these civil wars, and Egypt is really the last big independent kingdom left around the shores of the Mediterranean. Everything else has been conquered by Rome. So she is in this very precarious position where clearly she wants to maintain Egyptian independence, but Rome is this juggernaut that's rolling over everything. And she ends up meeting Julius Caesar when Caesar comes to Egypt chasing Pompey, his great rival. After he defeats Pompey, Pompey runs to Egypt thinking he'll find sanctuary there, and the Egyptians kill him and chop off his head. And when Caesar lands, they hand it to him and say, "Here, have a present." And she, of course, famously ends up having a love affair with Caesar. Was that a genuine love, or was she just sort of, using this as a way to try and keep Egypt independent, to give it some status? We don't know. After she does have several kids with Caesar. After Caesar's assassinated and the Roman world is having another civil war between Octavian and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is basing himself in the east. He meets Cleopatra, and he has a big love affair with her. And this one seems pretty genuine. Antony and Cleopatra, there's a lot of stories about them kind of partying together. They like to sort of cosplay and dress up as different gods. So Cleopatra would dress up as the goddess Isis, and Antony would dress up as the god Dionysus in a leopard skin, and they'd have these big parties and stuff. And they end up together fighting against Octavian. And in the end, they're defeated by Octavian. And Antony commits suicide. Cleopatra, there's differing accounts of her death. She may have also killed herself, or she may actually have been killed by Octavian to just get her out of the way. But she's an interesting figure because she was clearly a very smart woman who managed to keep Egypt alive as an independent state. She seemed to have actually cared about Egypt and identified with it. And succeeded at a time with all these famous people, in being a real kind of mover and shaker and a force in events.
She's probably one of the most influential women in human history.
She's certainly, again, she's someone that her image is incredibly important.
Yes.
And one of the interesting things, the whole question of gender in the Roman world. This gets into Roman sources, but of course it's a heavily male-dominated history. And men and women did not have equality in ancient Rome. It's a male-dominated society. It's misogynist in many ways. But what I'm constantly struck by is when you start, again, delving into the sources, you always hear, there was this one woman who was a philosopher, and she's an exception to the rule. And she's fine. And then you start looking at, and there's also 60 other female philosophers. Well, is that so much an exception anymore? Or, Cleopatra is the one queen, she's this strong queen. And then you look and, there was this other queen here, there was this queen here, there was this queen here who led armies, and here's another one who led armies. And again, it's like, are they exceptions to the rule, or is just the history that was written, which is written by men, a little bit selective in how it portrays them? Because the sources are all these male elites who have very definite ideas about women. The conventional notion has always been that, business in the Roman Empire was a male field. Well, but then there's this woman, Eumachia in Pompeii, who actually had the largest building in Pompeii right on the forum, named after her, with a giant statue of her, and she was a patron to a bunch of the most important guilds in Pompeii. Okay, she's the exception to the rule. Oh, but then there's these other 4 women we have from Pompeii who also were patrons of guilds. And then there's this woman, Plancia Magna, in this other place, and she was the most important patron in the town and put up all these statues. So at some point, when do you start to say, maybe women did play more of a role, but they just haven't been recorded in the sources in the way that maybe they deserve to be?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Is it the bias of society, or is it the bias of the historian? The bias of the society that the historian is writing about, or the bias of the actual historian? And
the bias of the historians who have written history up to this point.
Stargate.
I was just writing a lecture which was about this woman, Musa, who is a crazy story, and she ties into Augustus, actually. Augustus, his biggest diplomatic triumph that he boasted about constantly was that about 50 years before him, the Romans had sent an expedition into Parthia, this neighboring kingdom, led by Crassus, and they'd gotten wiped out. So it was this big disaster, military disaster. And the standards of the Roman legions, the eagles that each Roman legion carried, had been captured by the Parthians. And this is the most humiliating thing that can happen to a Roman legion, to have its eagles captured. And Augustus desperately wanted to negotiate with the Parthians to get these eagles returned. Okay, this was his big diplomatic thing. So he was constantly sending these embassies to Parthia. On one of these embassies, he sent along as a gift to to the Parthian king a slave woman named Musa. Musa seems to have pleased the king of Parthia because she becomes one of his concubines. And then she gives birth to a son by the king, and eventually she becomes upgraded to the level of wife. And Musa eventually murders the Parthian king, arranges it so that her son becomes the king of Parthia, and she's really ruling the whole empire behind the scenes as his mother. So this is a literal rags to riches story of a slave, someone who starts out a slave and becomes the queen of an empire almost as large and powerful as Rome. Okay? But yet, how often do we hear about Musa? And when you look in traditional histories of Roman-Parthian relations, and I went and looked at this because I was just writing this lecture, most of those histories didn't even mention her. They just talked about her son, like he had just come out of nowhere and become the new heir to the Parthian throne, when it was all her doing, clearly. Now that's selective editing of history by historians to downplay the role that this woman played. And there's a lot of examples like that.
That's fascinating.
She got overthrown after a few years. There was a revolution against her, and we don't know what happened to her then. But she's a really interesting figure. Oh, and by the way, Augustus did negotiate the return of the Parthian standards and got them back. And he was so proud of this that this is what he constantly boasted about. And the most famous statue of Augustus, the Augustus from Prima Porta, which is in the Vatican today, he's wearing a breastplate, and on the breastplate, right in the middle of the stomach, is a Parthian handing over a golden eagle legionary standard to a Roman. So this is what Augustus thought of as his greatest achievement. And that embassy that arranged that was the one that sent Musa to Parthia.
So Augustus marks the start of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
You've written that Octavian Augustus would become Rome's first emperor, and the political system that he created would endure for the next half a millennium. This system would become the template for countless later empires up through the present day, and he would become the model emperor against whom all subsequent ones would be measured. The culture and history of the Mediterranean basin, the Western world, and even global history itself were all profoundly shaped and influenced by the actions and legacy of Octavian. He was the founder of the Roman Empire, and we still live today in the world that he created. So, what, on the political side of things, and maybe beyond, what is the political system that he created?
Well, I mean, I think Octavian / Augustus, it's the same guy, is one of the most influential people in history because he did found the Roman Empire. So he's the one who oversaw this transition from Republic to Empire, and he sets the template which every future emperor follows. So just in the most obvious way, for the next either 500 or 1500 years, depending how long you think the Roman Empire lasted for, everyone is trying to be Augustus. They all take on the same titles. Every Roman emperor after him is Caesar Augustus, Imperator, Pater Patriae, all these titles he has, they take too. And so he's hugely influential for Western civilization, all this. But beyond just that literal thing, which is already 500 years, 1500 years, he becomes the paradigm of the good ruler. So an absolute ruler who is nevertheless sort of just, does good things, builds public works, is popular. So if we jump ahead, let's say, to the Middle Ages, the most significant ruler of the early Middle Ages is Charlemagne, right? He's the guy who unites most of Europe. He becomes the paradigm for all medieval kings after him. Well, what is the title that the Pope gives to Charlemagne? Because there's this famous moment when the Pope acknowledges Charlemagne as the preeminent European king and crowns him on Christmas Day of the year 800. And the title that the Pope gives to Charlemagne is Charles, that's Charlemagne, Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. He's giving him the title of Augustus because that's the nicest thing he can think of to say to Charlemagne, is to say, you're the new Augustus, you're Emperor of the Romans.
Yeah.
So that image is hugely powerful. And that persists on and on. I mean, even the literal names of most rulers afterwards come from this. In Russia, the czars are Caesars. That's where czar comes from. Prince comes from princeps, first citizen, one of the titles. Emperor comes from imperator, one of the titles of Augustus. When Napoleon becomes emperor, what does he call himself? First consul, which is kind of like princeps. And then he calls himself emperor. I mean, everybody wants to be this kind of ruler, so he's the paradigm of this for the rest of history. And you can see that as both a positive and a negative legacy. It's kind of like Alexander. I mean, everybody wants to be the next Alexander. Now, nobody does become the next Alexander. Nobody's as successful as him, but a lot of people try, and you can see that either as, oh, inspirational or awful, because lots of people killed lots of other people and started lots of wars trying to be the next Alexander. At least Augustus has this notion of good rulership, that you're not just a great powerful person, but you're a good ruler somehow.
Can you speak to the kind of political system he created? So, how did he consolidate power, as you spoke to a bit already, and what role did the Senate now play? How were the laws? Who was the executive? How was power allocated? So on.
Yeah, so once the empire begins, let's say 27 BC, so in 31 BC, Octavian defeats Antony at the Battle of Actium. So that's kind of the moment he becomes the sole ruler. And then in 27 BC, a couple of years later, he settles the Roman Republic, is how it's referred to, which basically sets up his system. And in this system, on the surface, it all looks the same. You still have a Senate. Each year, there's elections. All the Roman citizens vote. They elect magistrates who notionally are in charge of Rome. But, as I mentioned, off to the side, you now have this figure of Augustus, who sort of controls everything behind the scenes. And that continues. So this political system he establishes continues. And in reality, I would say Augustus at that point is again a king. It really is one man controlling the state, even if notionally it's still continuing as a republic. They are electing magistrates, but the magistrates only do what the emperor tells them, right? But it's this sort of formal versus informal power. The formal structure is a republic. The way things really work informally is it's a monarchy. Now, if you asked Augustus, what did he do? Did you become a king? He said, and he says this explicitly, no. What I did is I refounded the Roman Republic. That's how he phrases it.
Yeah, this guy's good at framing.
He's so good at propaganda. I'll give you one more example that I love. Augustus actually writes his own autobiography, which is very rare and survives. So here we have the autobiography of one of the pivotal figures in history. And if you had conquered the world, let's say, starting at the age of 18, what would you call your autobiography? It'd be something like, How I Conquered the World, right? Augustus calls his the Res Gestae, which the best sort of literal translation is stuff I did. I mean, it's the most modest title for someone who could have given the most grandiose title. And the first line of it is, at the age of 18, when the liberty of the Republic was oppressed by a faction, I defended it. Now, the way I might phrase that sentence is, at the age of 18, I fought a civil war against another Roman and conquered the Roman state. But no, he defended the liberty of the Republic when it was oppressed by the tyranny of a faction. That's propaganda. And it works.
It is propaganda, but is there a degree to which he also lived it? That kind of humility, establishing that humility is the standard of the way government operates. So it's not like a literal direct balance of power, but it's sort of a cultural balance of power, where the emperor is not supposed to be a bully and a dictator.
I would really like to know what Romans of his time thought. Like, if you were alive at that moment, would you honestly believe, oh, okay, we've got this guy Augustus, but he's brought peace, he's just kind of keeping in charge for a while till things settle down, we've just had 100 years of civil war, I think we still have a republic? Or would you say, nah, we have a king now? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I will tell you that it takes 200 years before we have the first Roman source that bluntly calls Augustus a king. So 200 years. It takes the Romans 200 years to admit to themselves. And that's a guy who comes along 200 years later and says, hey, Augustus, he looks like a king, he acts like a king, let's just call him a king, because he had every aspect of a king except the paltry title.
Maybe I'm buying his propaganda, and maybe I'm a sucker for humility, but I suspect that the Romans bought it. And I also suspect he himself believed it. I mean, there is such thing as good kings, right? There's kings that understand the downside, the dark side of absolute power, and can wield that power properly.
And
right?
and you know, to give sort of both sides here, Augustus wasn't all nice. I mean, there were moments where he was extremely cruel. So early in his career, when he's still fighting, when he's for power, he goes all in on prescriptions, which is where he and Antony and other people basically post lists of their enemies and say it's legal for anyone to kill these people. And so hundreds are massacred there, including Cicero, the great orator, is proscribed and killed. There's moments when he's really cruel. One slave once gets him angry and he has him tortured in a particularly sort of cruel manner. So, I mean, on the one hand, he had this clemency. On the other hand, he could be really hard-nosed, hard-edged. And I think he was a very calculating person.
Yeah. So the thing I would love to know is what he was actually like behind the mask.
Yes. I mean, that to me is one of those, you know, like, if you could invite a historical person to dinner or whatever, I want to know what the real Augustus was, what he really thought he was doing, because he's an enigma. And he has this great moment when he dies, right? What's his dying lines on his deathbed? He says, "If I've played my part well, dismiss me from the stage with applause." So he's seeing himself as an actor, that his whole life was acting this role, which is, again, all that manipulation and public image. He was brilliant at that, but who's the real guy? What was behind that image?
And by the way, as long as we're talking about brutality, I think you mentioned in a few places that there's a lot of brutality going on at the time. Caesar just killing very large numbers of people brutally.
I mean, Caesar, his campaigns in Gaul are interesting because for a long time they were held up as, oh, genius general, look at the amazing things he did. But another way to view it is he provoked, and he truly provoked, a war with people who were not that interested in fighting Rome, and just repeatedly attacked different tribes for the sole purpose of building up his career, his prestige, his status, gaining territory, making himself wealthier. And he basically conquers all of modern France and Belgium and some of Switzerland. So this is, you know, a big chunk of Europe gets conquered, hundreds of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people enslaved to further one guy's career. I mean, you, if you wanted, could call Caesar a war criminal, and I think that wouldn't be unfair. But on the other hand, some people see him as a great hero. I mean, to talk about history and its reception, it's quite interesting to see how Caesar has been viewed by different generations. So at different points in time, the sort of, you know, received wisdom on Caesar is very different. So back in the, you know, let's say the 1920s or 30s, there were a number of scholarly things written which kind of looked at Caesar as an admirable figure. He's a strong man who knows what Rome needed and, you know, was going to give it to them. And of course, that's the era when fascism was kind of trendy and was seen as a positive thing. And then you get, you know, Hitler in World War II, and all of a sudden fascism's not so favored anymore. And then in that post-war generation, all of a sudden Caesar's terrible. You know, he's a dictator. He's destroying the republic. So it, you know, often histories that are written tell you a lot more about the time they're written than they do about the subject they're written about.
Do we know, what did Hitler or Stalin think about the Roman Empire?
I mean, certainly they borrow a lot of the trappings. I mean, you know, Nazi Germany borrows a lot of iconography from ancient Rome. You know, I mean, they carried around little military standards with eagles on them, just like the Romans. But then everybody does that. I mean, the U.S. has eagles as their standards. Mussolini had them. Napoleon had eagle standards for his, you know, military. So a lot of people like that imagery.
You mentioned Cicero. He's a fascinating figure. On the topic of Roman oratory, who was Cicero?
Cicero was a new man, so he's someone who didn't have famous ancestors. So he was at a disadvantage. And I think Cicero is really interesting for a couple reasons. One is he wrote an incredible amount. I think we have almost more words from Cicero than any other author that survived. And it's all kinds of stuff. It's philosophical treatises, it's books about how to be a good public speaker. He published, volume after volume of his personal letters to his friends. He published these things. So there's tons of stuff from him. And secondly, he's interesting because he lived at this incredibly important time in the late Republic when things were falling apart. But he seems to have been born with none of the natural advantages that all these other people had. So he was a lousy general. He didn't come from a wealthy family. He didn't come from a famous aristocratic family. He didn't have a lot of these advantages, but yet he ended up being right at the center of things, rose to the highest elected office in the Roman state on the basis of one skill, and that was his ability with words, his ability to get up in front of a crowd and persuade them of what he wanted them to believe. And oratory, public speaking, was absolutely central to life at Rome. There were just all these events where people had to get up and give speeches. So in courtrooms, at funerals, in the Senate, to the people of Rome, at games. Just constantly there were these opportunities for giving speeches. So if you were good at this, that was a huge advantage in your political career. And Cicero was the best. He was arguably the best public speaker of all time, some people claim. And he lived right in this era, and he parlayed that skill with words into this very successful political career. He was one of the guys involved with all this stuff with Caesar and Pompey and all the other things going on, Octavian, Mark Antony.
And you've written, which is fascinating. It's fascinating when the echoes of people from a distant past are seen today. The same stuff is seen today, not just like some of the beautiful legal stuff that we've been talking about, but the tricks, let's say the shitty stuff we see in politics. So many of the rhetorical tricks you wrote, such as mudslinging, exaggeration, guilt by association, ad hominem attacks, name calling, fear mongering, us versus them, rhyme, and so on and so forth. Well, so I'm guessing it worked, given that we still have those today.
Yeah, one of the things Cicero did is he wrote at least 3 of these sort of handbooks about how to be a good public speaker. So we know a lot about that. We have his own speeches that survive, and then we have later people after Cicero who wrote about what Cicero did too. So we know a lot about what he did. And the key to Cicero's whole enterprise about persuading an audience, let's say either in a speech to the people or in the courtroom, is Cicero believed that people are fundamentally ruled by emotion. So if you can touch their emotions, all sorts of other things become less important. If you can get a jury emotionally worked up and fear, anger are particularly powerful there, then the facts might not matter, the truth might not matter, evidence might not matter, reason might not matter. Emotion is the key to everything. So Cicero used what I would arguably call a lot of tricks to get his audiences emotionally riled up. And you can just go through these, and they're all the stuff you were saying, name calling, mudslinging, us versus them arguments, ad hominem attacks. Incredibly sophisticated. All the stuff that we think of today as, very sophisticated techniques for, propaganda and persuasion. It's not new. People aren't coming up with that much that's new outside the realm of technology. Human nature is the same. Cicero understood human psychology. He knew how to play on people. He knew how to play on their emotions. And he would do just, I want to say hilarious, but they're sort of depressingly hilarious things. Like, he thought it's important to use props. So he said, people are visual. They will respond emotionally to visual things in a way that just words alone won't work. So he says, an orator is just like an actor, and like an actor, he has to prepare his stage and use props and things as visual cues to stir up the audience. So, for example, once he was defending a man in a court case who had just had a new baby born to him, and Cicero literally delivered the defense oration for this guy while cradling his newborn son in his arms. And, you can imagine, oh, cute little baby, jury, how could you find him guilty and leave this cute baby without a father to take care of him? Another time, he was defending a guy who had a photogenic son, a kind of a young boy, and Cicero literally propped up the kid behind him while he was giving the speech, and again said, look at his eyes brimming with tears, thinking about his father, being punished. How could you leave this wonderful boy without, a father to care for him. Another time, someone didn't have photogenic kids, so he propped up his old parents in the courtroom and said, "Look at this nice old couple. You won't want to take their son away." That kind of stuff. I mean, it's manipulative. Cicero, by the way, I should say, also had philosophical beliefs about defending the republic and such, but he wasn't above using these things. So even though he may have had altruistic or high notions of what he was doing, he also wasn't above using these kind of rhetorical tricks.
And also, you mentioned to me that you studied the gestures they used. So
Yeah,
this is one of those like on the theme of extremely interesting details of life.
this was actually my dissertation, and it was my
That's
first book as
amazing.
well.
That's amazing.
Is again, I tell you, I like practical stuff, and
Right.
this all started with I kept reading about people like Cicero giving speeches, okay, in ancient Rome, lots of speeches, and they would give a speech in the forum with 10, 20,000 people. And the thought occurred to me, well, in ancient Rome, you don't have microphones, you don't have loudspeakers. So how does someone give a speech outdoors in a windy place, not acoustically sound to 20,000 people? They just can't hear you. And the answer, part of the answer, turns out, well, part of it's oratorical training. You learn how to project your voice. But some of it, too, is that the Romans actually had this
I'm
system
gonna die
of
because I was AFK.
gestures that orators like Cicero would use to accompany their speeches. And what I ended up doing is combining two types of evidence again. So I looked at the rhetorical handbooks like Cicero's, and also there's this guy Quintilian who lived about 100 years after Cicero, who wrote this long thing called the Institutio Oratoria, which has a description of all types of oratorical stuff, including about 40 pages on gestures.
Good fight.
So he actually says when you put your fingers like this, it means such and such. And it turns out Roman orators had a system of sign language that they would use to augment their speeches. But here's the fun part. It wasn't like modern American Sign Language, where a gesture means the same thing as a word. Instead, and this goes back to Cicero, a certain gesture would indicate a certain emotion that you were meant to feel when you heard the words. So it's like your body is adding an emotional gloss to your speech. You're saying words, and then you're indicating how you think those words should make you feel. And even more fun, the Romans believed that if I make certain hand gestures, you will almost involuntarily feel certain emotions. So if you're skilled, you can manipulate your audience by playing on their emotions. And this might sound, kind of weird or improbable, but the metaphor that Cicero himself uses is he says, think about music. Everybody knows that certain musical tones will make you feel a certain way. So, think of movies today. In a horror movie, they're going to play strident, tense music. In a romantic scene, you're going to have strings, and it'll make you feel a certain way. When you hear the Jaws theme, you feel tense, right? Cicero said the orator's body is like a lyre. A lyre is a musical instrument, and you have to learn to play on your own body as a musical instrument to affect the emotions of your audience.
I think he might be onto something, especially given how central public speaking was to in Roman culture.
And a lot of the Roman oratorical gestures, like I could probably do some, and you could probably guess what emotion they're meant to be. So, for example, there's one where like you hold up your hands to the side and kind of push like this. So this is the gesture, and what that means is kind of mild aversion. I don't like something. Now, if I couple this with turning my face to the side, so pushing off to one side, turning my face away, it's a strong aversion. That's like fear or something. If I clench my fist and press it to my chest, that's anger or grief. If I slap my thigh, again, that's an indication of anger. So a lot of these make sense. I mean, they're kind of natural gestures. Now, some are really weird and artificial. One of my favorite of these is if you like hold your hand up open and then curl the fingers in one by one and then flip it out. So this sort of thing, that to the Romans meant wonder, which you sort of see. But again, if you've been raised in a societal context where you're used to the notion that this gesture means this emotion, when someone does it, you're probably going to feel that emotion.
It's like memes today. If it becomes viral,
you know what it's supposed to mean,
percolates
and
through the
has
culture
that effect.
and has power. I mean, and it's actually interesting that we don't use gestures as much in modern day.
Well, for me, I just love analyzing modern political figures in terms of their body language.
Yes,
because how you deliver a speech is often more important than what you say. In fact, in the ancient world, the most famous Greek orator was a guy named Demosthenes. And once a guy came up to
Unlock.
Demosthenes and said, Demosthenes, tell me, what are the three most important things in giving a speech? And Demosthenes said, well, they are delivery, delivery, and delivery. That even the most brilliant speech, if accompanied by a boring delivery, is going to be less effective than a terrible speech given in an engaging and exciting or funny way.
Speaking of modern day and gestures, what
This
do you
guy's
think
17.
of
Oops.
Donald Trump, who has these very unique kind of gestures? I think there's, I don't know to the degree to it's true, but he kind of uses these handshakes when he pulls people in, that kind of stuff. What do you make of that?
I mean, Trump gesticulates a lot, but it's a fairly narrow set of gestures. I mean, if you watch him for a bit, he kind of has the same small set of gestures. And they're not, honestly, they're not natural in that they're not kind of illustrating what he's saying. It's more just punctuation points. I think of his as more kind of these punctuation points for just going along with what he's saying. There are speakers who truly can use their hands and arms and faces creatively, and you watch them, and it's really enhancing the speech. I mean, just historically, Martin Luther King. He's famous for a lot of good speeches, content. He was a good gesticulator too. He knew how to use his body. On the other hand, Adolf Hitler was a phenomenal gesticulator. If you watch some of his speeches, even just like turn off the sound and watch them, he's doing all kinds of stuff, and he's really emphasizing his points in a very creative way. And this is what's fascinating about
seem like you really like
public
Hitler.
speaking is it's this two-edged sword. You can use these techniques for good, or you can absolutely use them for evil. You know,
Yeah.
so the very same techniques in the hands of MLK, you say this is wonderful, this is fantastic. In the hands of Hitler, you say this is awful. Look, he's persuading a nation to commit atrocities.
I encourage people to watch the speeches of Hitler, the oratory skill there,
Yeah.
to be able to channel the resentment,
I don't.
the frustration of
I don't encourage that.
control it and direct it any direction he wants.
Yes.
Through speaking alone.
Yeah, it's the
incredible.
visual embodiment of the words, where he's talking about Weimar Germany being taken advantage of supposedly and all this stuff. You're right, he's channeling the resentment of the people and using that to his personal advantage and for cynical evil really purposes. But oratory's like that. It's the question I always end up asking my students is, after studying Cicero and all these techniques, I say, okay, this is great oratory, but do you like this? Is this good that this works on human beings?
I remember Noam Chomsky once was asked, why do you speak in such a monotone way? And he said, well, I want the truth of my statement, the contents of my statements to speak, that I don't want you to get deluded by me because I'm such a charismatic and eloquent speaker. The more monotone I speak, the more you will listen to the content of the words.
Right, I want you just focusing on the content and not being distracted. I'll tell you also with Cicero, one of the things that he and other people who write about Roman oratory do is to say, and you can do this stuff badly, in which case it backfires horribly. So you can have people who attempt to gesticulate. Again, modern politicians, you'll see this sometime where they feel like, I'm supposed to be making hand gestures, and they're terrible at it, and it undercuts it. And Cicero and Quintilian give some very amusing examples from ancient Rome. So like he says, there was this one guy who, when he spoke, looked like he was trying to swat away flies, because there were just these awkward gestures. Or another who looked like he was trying to balance in a boat, like in choppy seas. And my favorite is there was one orator who supposedly was prone to making, I guess, kind of languid, supple motions. And so they actually named a dance after this guy. And his name was Titius. And so Romans could do the Titius, which is this dance that was imitating this orator who had these, kind of comically bad gesticulation. So not enough gesticulation is a problem. Too much gesticulation is a problem. You have to hit the sweet spot. It has to seem natural. It has to seem varied. It has to conform to the meaning of the words, not distract from it.
Yeah, natural to your, like authentic to who you are.
Authentic.
Which is when people try to copy the gestures of another person, it usually doesn't go well.
Right.
You have to kind of, you have to interpret, integrate into your own personality and so on.
But gestures is a really fun.
It's
So
fascinating.
I enjoyed my dissertation a lot doing that. Because what I was trying to do there was to literally reconstruct them. So to say, what were the actual gestures? And I did that by comparing the literary accounts of the handbooks with, again, Roman art, looking at statues of Romans and things, and just trying to say, okay, what were some of the gestures they actually used?
And in that way, the people from that time come to life in your mind and your work. Just it's
Well,
fascinating.
again, it's this pragmatic thing. I want to know, okay, how does this work?
Could we talk about the role of religion in the Roman Empire? What's the story there?
I mean, religion's interesting because, in my mind, the rise to dominance in a lot of the world of monotheistic religions is one of the huge sort of turning points, because it's just such a different mentality. I mean, it's very, very different where you say there's one God and it's my God versus, okay, I believe in this God, but there's an infinite number of legitimate gods. And nowadays, particularly in the West, we tend to view the monotheistic perspective as the norm. But for, more than half of human history, it was not. It was used to be the notion in a lot of Roman history up until about 300 AD. The idea was, well, there's just a ton of gods floating around, and maybe you worship that one, and I worship these two that I like, and the guy across the street worships the oak tree in his backyard, and it's all good. They're all legitimate things. Versus, oh no, now there is one God and only one God that's the correct answer. And as soon as you do that, religion becomes foregrounded in your decision making much more. I mean, the Romans had religion, but it wasn't really driving anything, if you know what I mean. It was auxiliary to things rather than a central force. So for a lot of Roman history, you had a standard kind of, I guess, pagan polytheism where there's a bunch of gods. There's certain gods who are associated with the Roman state, and there would be prayers said to those gods on behalf of the Roman state. But it wasn't really, you weren't trying to execute the will of Zeus or something, or Jupiter or Mars or anybody else. And in your private life, it was the same thing. You might ask certain gods for help, but it wasn't as much of a dominant thing in your own existence. So I think that's a real transition point where religion started to become so foregrounded. And as soon as you get the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in particular, it really shifts how people start to think about themselves in relationship to the world around them.
So, Jesus was born during the rule of Emperor Augustus.
Yep.
And
Which is kind of neat that, really influential people in the realm of political events and religious events coexisted. What are the odds?
I mean, yeah, there's certain moments in history where just a lot of interesting, powerful people come together and make history. And he was crucified under Emperor Tiberius' rule.
Yep.
Why were the ideas of Jesus seen as a threat by the emperor?
The thing that causes conflicts between the Romans and Christians is a little bit strange. It's all with this, where the Romans had a tradition of, on the emperor's birthday, sort of saying a prayer, basically wishing him good luck. Okay, but technically it's in the form of sacrificing to that part of the emperor that might become divine after his death. So to the Romans, this is the equivalent of a patriotism act, saying, the Pledge of Allegiance or something to the country. But of course, to Christians, this is worshiping another god. And I think there's almost a failure of communication here. That the Romans just, at least initially, didn't quite understand this is really problematic for these people, because they're coming from a polytheistic perspective where, yeah, everybody has different gods, so what? This isn't a religious problem, this is a political one. That why won't you send good wishes to the emperor? If you're a loyal Roman, this is something you should want to do. And many of the early Christians, I think, would have been fine with that, but it took the form of what they were asked to do was to basically worship another god. And that was the sticking point. And this is where I think movies have kind of warped some of our images of Roman history, that Hollywood loves to depict very early Christians, and I'm talking like first 200 years here after the ministry of Christ, as a group that all the Romans were obsessed with, that they were constantly trying to persecute and all this. And honestly, I think the Romans at that point were more just sort of indifferent or didn't know what was going on. And if you look at some of the primary sources at that time, I mean, there's this very famous letter by a guy named Pliny, who was a Roman governor
Pliny
of a
the Elder.
province in the
Yep.
east. And he has the habit of writing letters to the Roman emperor at the time, who was Trajan, every time he had a problem with being governor. And so this is great. This is the two highest governmental officials in the Roman world sort of hammering out policy between them, right? The emperor and one of his governors. And so this is about 100 years, 100 AD about. And Pliny says, hey, emperor, I had this issue. I had these people come before me called Christians. I don't quite know what to do with them. What should my policy be? And here's what I know about them. And what he knows is almost nothing. I mean, it's this almost comic, like, garbling. And, they have this weird thing where they get together on some day of the week and they sort of swear oaths to one another not to do bad stuff, which is, of course, his garbled understanding of the Ten Commandments, And then they have breakfast together and they eat food, and this is communion, but he doesn't get that that's what's going on. And so he's really ignorant. But I think that the broader point is, okay, this is one of the best educated, best traveled Romans who has the most experience in the empire, has been all over the empire. And what does he know about Christianity? Basically nothing. So if one of the best educated, most widely traveled guys really doesn't know much about them, that kind of suggests that not many people did at this point in time.
At this time, it was a fringe movement that they did.
Very fringe. I mean, it was one of, hundreds of little mystery religions the Romans sort of thought of them as. And these are, religions that have some sort of revealed knowledge and that make more personal appeals to people. Now, stepping back from this in a broad way, I think you could say that Christianity really was different in some ways and had some things that maybe the Romans should rightfully have viewed as a threat. I mean, the Romans are people very focused on this world, right? Citizenship, what you do. Christianity, in essence, has a focus on the next world. So this world isn't as important as what you're setting yourself up for. And even worse, from a Roman perspective, I'm kind of saying, okay, if I were a Roman, Romans are all about making distinctions between people. Citizen, non-citizen. Man, woman, free, slave. Christianity comes along and says, in God's eyes, you're all equal. Now, that's a pretty problematic idea if you're deeply invested in Roman hierarchy. And I think it is no surprise that among the earliest converts to Christianity are women and slaves, and in particular, female slaves. Now, who are they? They're the people at the rock bottom of the Roman hierarchy of status, right? Which the Romans are obsessed with status, but here's a religion that says that doesn't matter. And in that same letter to Pliny, Pliny says, okay, in this group of Christians I've heard about, their leaders are two female slaves they call deaconesses. Now, this is really early. This is before the church exists, right? There's no church structure yet. And who is leading the local congregation of Christians? Two slave women. So that's an interesting moment, and that's not necessarily the image we get of early Christianity. But you can see how, for people in this social structure, that would be very appealing to them. And in some ways, yeah, it is sort of a threat to the Roman system because they're challenging it. Now, the irony is, of course, 300 years after the life of Christ, the emperor converts to Christianity, and another 100 years later, under Theodosius, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. So all of a sudden you have this flip-flop where now the state itself is not just converted to Christianity, but actively promoting it, and now persecuting pagans. And the reason the emperors do that is one of the biggest problems for emperors at that point in time is legitimacy. That there's tons of civil wars where you have lots of different people saying, I'm emperor. So lots of generals declaring themselves emperor. Now, under a polytheistic religion, that's just, you're all just fighting, it doesn't matter. But if you say there is only one God, then if that God picks someone to be his emperor, they're the only legitimate emperor, right? So there is a real advantage to emperors now becoming Christian. Because if they can say, we're now a Christian empire, and there's only one God, and I'm the guy that God picked to be emperor, that means all these other people claiming to be emperors are illegitimate.
Do you think that, or is there other factors that explain why Christianity was able to spread?
Well, I mean, that's why it's appealing to the emperors. And we're talking here, I mean, the religious answer is people see the light, right? It's a faith-based thing. I'm looking at this as a historian. So putting aside, religious feeling and saying, okay, if I'm doing an analysis of this as a social phenomenon, what would be appealing to people? And there is that very compelling reason for emperors to want to go to Christianity because it helps them with their biggest problem, which is legitimacy. Now, if you're a ordinary person, what is the appeal of Christianity? Well, we already looked at a couple of them. One of them is that, it promises you a reward in the afterlife. I mean, the Roman and Greek notions of the afterlife aren't that appealing. Either you just sort of turn into dust, or at best you turn into this kind of ghost thing that floats around something that looks like a Greek gymnasium, which is like a bunch of grassy fields. It's not so hot. So here you're offered the idea of like, oh, you go to paradise forever. That sounds really good. And secondly, for a lot of people in Roman society, that notion of here's something that says I'm valuable as a human being. It doesn't matter whether I'm free or slave. It doesn't matter whether I'm Roman or non-Roman. It doesn't matter if I'm man or woman. Here's something that says I have equal value. That's enormously appealing. And finally, early Christians, I mean, they honestly, a lot of them do good works. They take care of the sick. They feed the poor. I mean, if you look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, that's the stuff he really hammers. If we look at, the words of Jesus when he says, what do you do to be a Christian? A lot of it is take care of the unfortunate. Take care of people who are sick. Take care of people who are starving. And a lot of the early Christians really take that seriously. So they are helping people out. So that's appealing.
They're the good kind of populist, and populist messages spread. Let me ask you about gladiators.
Switch of pace here.
What role did they play in Roman society?
I mean, okay, gladiator games obviously become a popular form of entertainment, and they're one of the ones that's captured people's imaginations for all sorts of reasons. I mean, it's dramatic, but also I think it's that apparent contradiction that in so many ways Roman society seems familiar to us. In so many ways it seems sophisticated and appealing. Law is wonderful, all this, but yet for fun they watched people fight to the death. So how do you reconcile these things? Gladiators I find very interesting because they're an example of what historians call status dissonance. So it's someone who in society has high status in some ways and very low or despised status in another. So gladiators, most of them were slaves, the lowest of the low in Roman society, right? Also, they're fighting for other people's pleasure and dying sometimes for other people's pleasure. And the Romans had a real thing about this, like your body being used for others' pleasure. Even a humble working person who hired themselves out for labor, the Romans thought that was innately demeaning because you're using your body for someone else's benefit or pleasure. So they didn't have this notion of the dignity of hard labor.
Yeah, I don't have that
either. The
either.
Profession was farming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
There you generate something and you're producing it for yourself. But if you work for someone else, you're demeaning yourself.
Yep, I feel
and
so.
Gladiators are the worst of the worst, right?
Wow, I've never heard of somebody say that before. Wow, like I have a very Roman view of work. If I'm not working for myself, then then it's demeaning. Like anytime that I do, I love doing favors for people, and I'm a happy person. I like helping people, but when it comes to work, I pretty much I'll only do that for myself. It's kind of weird, but I do feel that way. Like, what's the point of being alive then? I could sit and philosophize about this for days. What is the point of being alive if you're doing something for somebody else? What is the point of all the breaths that you took, or the water that you drank, or the 9 months of labor your mother went through, or all the education you got, or you know, all your family time, all of your brother protecting you through the childhood, that kind of thing. All excuse me. Um excuse me. All of the all of that stuff, like, that's cool. We all have, like, you know, people that we want to help in family, and we have like a genetic reason to help family, but like, I still don't really see working for others. I don't really see that. I see them offering you something in return that's equal, but I don't really see the, like, the whole the dignity in doing work for others, and a hard day's labor and all that stuff. I've never saw it. I've never seen. I've never known what that meant. I'm like, what's a good day's labor? Not doing labor, honestly. You know, spoken like the lazy asshole that I am. But a good day's labor to me is not doing any labor. You know what I'm saying? I'm dead serious too, and it's weird. It's like, but all around me I see these people whose lives are just not fulfilled, so they fulfill it with work, and then they frown on other people who don't do the same. But I posit that unless that work is something to enrich you directly, like my stream, for instance, why would you do it? If whatever you're doing doesn't enrich you, why would you do it? Just saying. Why would you work for others every day in a cubicle? Why would you have a boss? That's not you. They don't care what happens to you when you go to home to bed at night. They don't care, you know, about your mother's 9 months of labor. Like, working for others, I'll work with others. And I believe in the power of people as you know, as opposed to the notion of power over people. But I don't think, you know, it's weird. It's weird. It's like, I don't think I could ever. I've worked for other people, but I felt that that was like a direct trade, and I think that's okay to work for other people. But I felt that it was a direct trade to get money. Yeah. To get money to pay for things. But I've never had a career, and I've never had a job that ever felt like it was actually putting food on the table. I only felt like I was basically working from paycheck to paycheck and staying alive and staying above destruction, just barely above it. And yeah, and that's, you know, that's how I feel about that. It's weird. It's like I guess I appreciate now I appreciate it when somebody does a job well, you know, and I try to do it. If I'm going to do anything, I try to do something well. How much was this? This was, oh, that's not me. Captured. I guess I did capture. So how much was this? It was 15K. Not bad. Am I safe here? Not really. So, yep, I can afford to buy these copper.
So on the one hand, they're very low status, but on the other hand, successful gladiators get famous. People admire them. Women find them attractive. They're celebrities. And so this is the status dissonance, right? You have these people who, on the one hand, formally are very low status in society, but yet are very popular on the other hand. Another kind of myth about gladiators is that they were just dying all the time. I mean, you watch, movies, and again, they'll always throw a bunch of gladiators and they all die.
Warp drive
I think
active.
some scholar did a study of there's like 100 fights we know of where we know some details, and I think 10% of those ended in the death of one of the people. So gladiators are a lot more like boxing matches, where you're watching a display of skill between two people who are more or less evenly matched in terms of their abilities, and probably they'll survive, though there's a chance that one of them might get injured.
Warp
In fact,
drive
one might
active.
die. Having said all that, in the end,
Sounds like MMA.
you really are having people fight and potentially die for the pleasure of an audience. And anthropologists and Roman historians like to speculate, why did the Romans do this? The Romans address it. I mean, there's a famous thing where a Roman says, we Romans are a violent people, we're a warlike people, and so it's fitting that we should be accustomed to the sight of death and violence. Kind of works. There's a more symbolic interpretation that says the amphitheater is an expression of Roman dominance, a symbolic expression. Because what you have are all segments of Roman society gathered together to control the fate of others. So you have foreigners, you have wild animals, you have criminals, you have other people. And we are symbolically asserting our dominance over those groups by determining, do you live or do you die? And that kind of works too. And the cynical one is humans like violence. I mean, when people watch a hockey game, what gets them most excited? The fight. When people watch car racing, there's a crash. What's going to be shown on the news? It's the crash. So there's something dark in human nature sometimes that likes violence, and maybe the Romans are just being more honest about it than we are.
I think Dan Carlin has a really great episode called Painfotainment. And I think in that episode he suggests the hypothetical that if we did something like a Gladiator Games today to the death, that like the whole world would tune in.
Yeah.
Especially if it was anonymous, right? We have a kind of like thin veil of civility underneath which we probably would still be something deep within us would be attracted to that violence.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there always is it human nature? Why do people slow down when there's a car wreck and try and see what's happening? On the other hand, to be fair, I mean, there were Romans at the time who morally objected to them and said this is, morally degenerate to take pleasure in this, and that's wrong.
What?
So I think in all eras you have a diversity of opinions. There's no unanimous, take on what this is or what this means.
So who usually were the gladiators? Was it slaves? Was it...
Well, the most common source, again, is prisoners of war. So if you conquer some people and they seem to be warlike, you might well consign some of them to fight in the arena. And the other thing about gladiators is they were highly trained professionals. So, the gladiator schools who trained them were spending a lot of money to train these people. And it wasn't just we take some guy and throw him into the arena like you see in movies all the time. These were people that you'd invested a lot of money in. That's why you don't really want to see them
Fucking
killed.
caster.
But yeah, mostly they're prisoners of war. I mean, in very rare instances, you might have a free person volunteering or even selling themselves to fight as gladiators, but much more common was that. And what's interesting is some people wouldn't do it. I mean, there's a lot of instances of gladiators refusing to fight and committing suicide, which you don't hear. So like there was one German who was supposed to fight as a gladiator, and instead he stuck his head between the spokes of a wagon that was spinning and snapped his own neck. There were a group of 29 Germans who all sort of said, we're not going to fight for the Romans' pleasure, and they strangled one another the night before they were supposed to fight. So, I mean, you have people sort of objecting to being complicit in this kind of performance as well.
And they also had interest in animals.
Yes.
So humans fought animals. exotic animals.
And animals fought animals.
Animals
Yeah,
fought
the
animals.
Romans were a little weird with their animal thing. They loved exotic animals, but mostly they liked to see exotic animals die. So, I mean, there was an enormous industry collecting wild beasts, transporting them to Rome, which is no easy matter to transport elephants and giraffes and rhinos, particularly in this era of technology. But they were like draining Africa and bringing lions and all these things and sacrificing them.
And what about the different venues? I mean, there's the legendary Colosseum. What is the importance of this place?
Well, the Colosseum, its real name is the Flavian Amphitheater, is interesting because for a long time, Rome always had a chariot racing arena, the Circus Maximus, but it didn't have a permanent gladiatorial venue until relatively late, till about 80 AD, so during the reign of the Emperor Vespasian. And he built this thing. So he built the Flavian Amphitheater. He was from the Flavian family of emperors. And he did it as a deliberate act of propaganda. So before him had been Nero, who was sort of seen as a crazy or bad emperor. And one of Nero's indulgences is he had built this enormous palace for himself called the Golden House. So it was kind of this pleasure palace with 50 dining rooms and all this stuff. And it was basically wasting a ton of money on him, right? So right on the site where Nero had his golden house, Vespasian says, I'm going to erect a new building on top of it that's going to be for the pleasure of the people. So it was very much a political statement that my dynasty is going to be about serving Romans, not serving ourselves. And so that's why he builds the Flavian Amphitheater. And the funds he uses from it is basically from looting Jerusalem.
What?
The
That
other
thing
thing
like
he'd done just
one
before
shot
this is
me.
he'd sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple there, in fact. He and his son Titus. And so this is what he now builds in Rome, is his gift to the people of Rome.
But it's interesting to
God.
think about that place, to think about their relationship with violence across centuries, for spectacle, watching people fight. And like you said, only like 10% of the time it led to the death. But I read that still a lot of people died. A lot of gladiators were killed.
Oh yeah.
There's numbers are just crazy. I read 400,000 dead. So this includes gladiators, slaves, convicts, prisoners, and so on. That's a lot of people.
The Flavian Amphitheater is really interesting too, just as a piece of technology and as influence on later world. I mean, almost every sporting arena today owes something to the Flavian Amphitheater, the Colosseum, in terms of construction. And it was amazingly sophisticated building. I mean, it had, retractable awnings and elevators and ramps that things could just pop up into the arena from below. And it had very well designed passages where everybody could file in and file out very efficiently, and they were all numbered. So I mean, it's one of, I think, the most influential buildings in history, just because of the way that all these buildings we go to today, they're all kind of variants on it and using some of the ideas from it.
And the Romans took their construction seriously.
Oh yeah, they were good at that. So they were excellent engineers. And the Romans were excellent engineers, especially when it came to what you might think of as humble stuff. I mean, today we tend to think of, a Roman building as shining white marble, right? Well, the core of that building was probably concrete, and the marble is just a superficial facade. And if you think about the Colosseum in Rome today, all the marble has been stripped off that building, and what you see is the concrete core, the structural core that's left. And the Romans, I mean, they didn't invent concrete, but they just used it more creatively than anyone had before. And if you look at buildings like the Greeks built, they're all rectilinear. They're all rectangles or squares, and they always have a lot of columns because you need to hold the roof up. The Romans, because of their use of concrete,
Oh, that's
could
why
build
my
wooden
gear's
frames.
busted.
They could have curves,
No
they
wonder.
could have domes, they could have all kinds of stuff.
I was like, why am I being one shot
It
by
just
this thing?
explodes the architectural possibilities. They also made a lot of use of the vault. So if you cut rocks and arrange them so they form a curve, you can have big vaulted spaces. And they were just brilliant with their mix of things. I mean, the Pantheon is the best preserved Roman building, and it's another brilliant building, incredibly influential. I mean, every Capitol building in the world or museum is an imitation of the Pantheon. You know, the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the Capitol in Madison, where I'm from, Wisconsin, Austin, where we are now. They're all Pantheons. You know, it's a big dome with a triangular pediment and some columns on the front. So it's just an amazingly influential building, but it's brilliant because the way it's constructed is, you know, the concrete at the bottom of the dome is both thicker and has a denser formulation. So it's heavier where it needs to bear the weight. And then as you get further up the dome, it gets narrower and narrower, and they mix in different types of rock. So at the top, you're using pumice, that very light volcanic stone. So where you want it to be light, it's light. And it's here 2,000 years later. I mean, look around you. How many buildings that we're building now do you think are going to be here in 2,000 years? I suspect not many.
And it's not only that they lasted, but they were beautiful, or at least in our current conception of beauty.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Vitruvius, you know, his principles are things should be functional and they should be aesthetically pleasing. So that's a winning combination, I think.
Yeah, they pulled that off pretty well. If we could talk about the
Damn
long line of
ghost.
emperors that made up the Roman Empire, how were they selected?
Oh boy, this is we've been talking about Augustus's great achievements and how clever he was with propaganda and all. This is his great failure. So his great failure is that he did not solve was the problem of succession. How do you ensure that the next person who follows you is not just the best person, but is qualified? And he fails to do it. So the principle he settles on is heredity. So the nearest blood relative. And he goes through all these people, all these young kids in his family die. He keeps trying to make the heir. And he ends up making his heir Tiberius, who he never liked. It was his stepson. He didn't like him. But he ends up inheriting it. And the next set of emperors,
Fucking
the Julio
mage.
Claudians, which is the family that Augustus starts, they all basically are who is the nearest male relative to the previous emperor. And that's how we get a lot of crazy emperors like Caligula or Nero. And then the next family, the Flavians, the first guy is kind of an Augustus. It's Vespasian, the one who builds the Flavian amphitheater. And then one of his sons takes over Titus, who's okay. And then the next son takes over Domitian, who's nuts again. So heredity just isn't working. And Rome fights a couple civil wars. And then 98 AD, we're 100 years now into the empire. And they look back at this track record and say, okay, we've been picking our emperors by heredity, and we've gotten some real duds here, some real problematic people. Is there a way to fix this? And this is one of the few instances where the Romans, who I keep saying are very traditional and resist change, I think actually make a change and realize we got to do something different. And so the next guy looks around and says, okay, forget who's my nearest male relative. Who's the best qualified to be emperor after me? I'll pick that person, and then I'll adopt him as my son. So they kind of stick with the heredity, but now it's this fake adoption. And you end up with a lot of old guys adopting middle-aged adults as their son, which is a little strange, but it works. And so for the next 80 years, you have only 5 emperors, and they're often called the 5 good emperors. They're not related necessarily by blood. They sort of pick the best qualified guy, and they're all sound, competent, good emperors.
I'm gonna go get a
And the
popsicle.
2nd century AD from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius is often regarded as the high point of the Roman Empire. And a lot of that comes from you have political stability. You have a succession of decent guys being emperor who rule relatively wisely, promote good policies. There's other things working to Rome's advantage, but that's good. And then where it falls apart is where the last guy, Marcus Aurelius, looks around and says, who's the best qualified guy to succeed me? What a coincidence. It's my own dear son, who turns out to be a psycho. And then it all goes downhill.
And some people place the sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire there at the end of Marcus Aurelius' rule.
Yeah, so 180 AD is one common date for an early date for the end of the Roman Empire because from then on it's a mixed bag of good and bad emperors.
At the very least, this period is when the Roman Empire is at its height on all different kinds of perspectives.
Certainly geographically, I mean, at this point stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from Egypt up to Germany. like I said, probably about 50 million people within its boundaries. Within those boundaries, there's relative peace. So, I mean, sometimes people talk about the Pax Romana. I mean, the Romans are fighting lots of people, but within the boundaries, you have relative peace. There's relative economic prosperity. I mean, nothing in the ancient world is that prosperous. It's just a different sort of economy, but it's pretty stable. There's no huge disasters happening yet. Some plagues start in Marcus Aurelius's reign. But yeah, this is pretty much seen as the high point of the Roman Empire, and I think it is. I think that there's truth to that.
Let me ask the ridiculously oversimplified question, but who do you think is the greatest Roman emperor, or maybe your top
Greatest
three?
Emperor. I tell you what. I'll tell you my favorite Roman, who wasn't an emperor, and that's Marcus Agrippa, who was
Minus Pliny the
Augustus's
Elder.
right-hand man. So Agrippa's this
Or
interesting
Plato.
guy who is extremely talented. He's a terrific general. He's a terrific admiral. He's a great builder. He, is kind of like the troubleshooter for Augustus. He's the guy who wins the Battle of Actium for Augustus. So literally, Augustus would not have become the first emperor without Agrippa. When Augustus rebuilds the city of Rome, it's Agrippa that he gives the job to. Agrippa rebuilds the Campus Martius. He builds the first version of the Pantheon. He personally goes through the sewers to clean them out. And he just has this great set of qualities that he's very self-effacing. I think he likes power. He wants real power, but he realizes I don't have that kind of clever politician's ability to be the front guy. So I'll just serve my friend Augustus loyally. They were childhood friends. I'll win the battles for Augustus, and I'll let him take all the credit. But I'll be his number two guy, and that's what I'm good at. And he realizes his limitations. I mean, so many people don't. So many people are like, oh, I just want to keep, grabbing for more and more and more when it's not something they're good at. And I think Agrippa says, I'm good to this point, and I'll play that role and no more, and that'll give me a lot of power, but I'm not going to press it. And he's just very hardworking. He's modest. He's self-effacing. He's highly competent.
I wonder how many people in history there are that are like the drivers, the COO of the whole operation that we don't really think about or don't talk about enough, to where sort of they're really the mastermind.
Or the ones who make something possible. I mean, even in this conversation today, you would not have Alexander the Great without his father, Philip II, having built that army and handed it to him on a silver platter. Octavian would never have become emperor without Agrippa. So they play central roles sometimes. But if I had to pick an emperor, I'd probably pick Augustus, just because of his influence. And because I admire his the thing Agrippa didn't have, his political savvy, his manipulation of image and propaganda, all that I find very fascinating. Though I'm not sure he's a great human being, but he's a really interesting figure.
Whether he's good or bad, he was extremely influential on defining just the entirety of human history that followed.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most influential humans ever. Nevertheless, if you ask in public who the most famous Roman emperor is, would that be Marcus Aurelius potentially?
I don't know.
But he's up
question.
there, right?
He's real famous because he was a Stoic philosopher and he wrote this book, The Meditations.
I mean, it's just interesting. Stoicism had, as a philosophical ideology, had a role to play during that time. I mean, there's the tragic fact that did Nero murder Seneca?
Yes. Well, he drove him to suicide, let's say.
There's a lot of interesting questions there, but one is like the role, especially when it's hereditary, the role of the mentor, like who advises who with Aristotle and Alexander the Great, like that dance of who influences and guides the person as they become and gain power is really interesting.
Well, I mean, one of the big questions with the Roman emperors, and we've been talking about some of them, is why did so many seem to be either crazy or just kind of sadists? And that's, I don't know that there's a good answer to that. I mean, people have theories, Caligula got a brain fever and changed after that or something, but I think there's a lot of maybe truth in the notion that the ones who seem to go craziest quite often are the ones who become emperor at a young age. And And there is something about that old cliche.
I have
that
605,000
absolute power corrupts absolutely,
LP.
especially
That's like
if
a
your own
billion ISK.
personality isn't really
I've
fully
been making
formed yet.
so
You know what I'm
much
saying?
money.
I mean, I think take anybody when they're a teenager. If you all of a sudden said you have unlimited power, you know, what would that do to you? How would that warp your personality? I mean, look at all the what do they always have to say, like the Disney stars who sort of go wrong or something because they get rich and famous at this very young age.
Yeah, fame, power,
drive
and even
active.
money. If you get way too much of it at a young age,
Yeah.
I think we're egotistical, narcissistic, all that kind of stuff as babies. And then when we clash with the world and we figure out the morality of the world, how to interact with others, that other people suffer in all kinds of ways, understand like the cruelty, the beauty of the world, the fact that other people suffer in different ways, the fact that other people are also human and have different perspectives, all of that, in order to develop that, you shouldn't be blocked off from the world, which power and money and fame can do.
And conversely, a lot of the emperors we regard as, you know, quote, good emperors are the ones who become emperor at a, you know, middle-aged or something, where their personalities are fully formed, where they're not going to really become different people. And so that works in that theory too. I mean, I don't think it's absolute, and of course, the greatest exception is Octavian Augustus, who, you know, starts his rise to power as a teenager, but somehow doesn't seem to go nuts.
Yeah,
So
history has
it's
a lot
not
of
an absolute, but it doesn't help to get that much power at a young age, I think.
What does it take to be a successful emperor, would you say?
So you say, well, what does it take to be a good Roman emperor? You know, if you were going to draw up, you know, a job description, seeking Roman emperor, what are the qualities and qualifications you would put on it? Obviously, you would put, you know, responsible, good understanding of military, economics, whatever, ability to delegate. But just to be fun, let's consider how much does it matter whether the emperor is good or bad? Because in the ancient world, what does it affect, really, if you're, say, a peasant in Spain, if the emperor is crazy Nero or good Vespasian? I mean, how does that affect your day-to-day life? How does it affect you if you're a peasant in Italy, which is the average inhabitant? I mean, the crazy emperors mostly affect the people within the sound of their voice. So yeah, they go crazy. They murder senators. They murder their members of their own family. They do wacky stuff. But a lot of that is constrained to the immediate surroundings around them. And meanwhile, the mechanism of the Roman Empire is just grinding along as it would anyway. I mean, the governors are running their provinces, stuff's happening. You know, I mean, I guess an emperor can start a war. He can maybe raise taxes. But that would be the ways that he's affecting the whole empire. And here we get into technology does matter. We're dealing with a world where, let's say you're in Rome and you're the emperor, and you want to send a message to a province far away, let's say Judea. That message might take 1 or 2 months to get there, and 1 or 2 months to get a reply. So how much influence as emperor are you really having over that province? I mean, those people pretty much have to make their own decisions and then kind of just say to you, this is what we did, I hope that's okay. Because otherwise nothing gets done if they're waiting 4 months for a decision.
Even in the realm of ideas, they can't get on TV and on the radio.
Yeah,
and
communication
and broadcast
is so slow and so uncertain in ways that today, with the ability to instantaneously talk to people across the world, we can't even imagine. And the Roman Empire is huge. I mean, it is months to send a message and get an answer. So here you have the emperor in Rome. Yeah, he affects who's around him, and he can affect even common people. I mean, there's crazy emperors who are at the games and they're bored and they say, well, take that whole section of the crowd and throw him to the lions or something. There you're being affected by the emperor. But if you're outside the range of his sight and voice, do you care who the emperor is?
So the big one,
most of the time.
That's a really important idea to sort of to remember. Same with U.S. president, frankly, in terms of the grand arc of history, like what is the actual impact? But I would say the big one is probably starting wars.
Yeah.
Major global wars, or ending them in both directions, and then taxation too, as you said. What was the taxation? What was the economic system? What was the role of taxation in Roman Empire?
Romans are really weird with this. So, in the Republic, once they started to acquire overseas provinces, right? they had to decide, well, what are we going to do with these provinces? And they, in the end, settled on this notion of we'll put a Roman governor in charge, we'll collect some sort of taxes. But they often didn't collect the taxes directly. Instead, they would sell contracts.
Well, at least I let
to private
myself some
businesses
content to
collect
do.
Taxes. So the private businesses would bid and say, all right, if you give us the contract to collect taxes in Sicily, we'll give you X number of money up front, and then we go out and try to collect enough to make back that money and make ourselves a profit. And this is a terrible system, because obviously they're going to go and try and squeeze as much as they can out of Sicily. And these companies were called publicans, publicani. And in the Bible, there's a phrase, publicans and sinners, and that should give you an idea how they're viewed. So everybody hated these tax collectors, and it was a really kind of dumb system, because, you know, the publicans were going out and squeezing way more than they should in an unhealthy way from the provinces, and the Roman state was doing this kind of weird thing that they should have been doing themselves. And over time that shifts a bit, and it becomes more like your standard taxation. And a lot of the taxation ends up being in kind too. So it's like, okay, we're taxing you, you pay it in wheat if you're a farmer or something, not necessarily in cash. So it was, in many ways, the Roman economy is underdeveloped. They didn't have a lot of the sophisticated systems that we have today, and it probably held them back in some ways. And again, they have that resistance to change. The Romans also had weird notions about just business and profit making. That at least originally there was this notion that's shameful. Again, the only thing that's a worthwhile profession is farming. So, you know, rich Romans would get involved in what we would call business, you know, manufacturing, particularly long distance trade with ships, but they would often do it through sort of front companies or employees who did it on their behalf officially, and then they sort of funnel the profits to the guy funding it because they don't want to be soiled with, you know, business which is beneath them. So the Romans had a lot of weird attitudes about the economy that I think in some ways didn't help.
But nevertheless, they had many of the elements of the modern economic system with taxation, the record keeping.
They were good at record keeping. So the Romans, I mean, the census is a Roman word. They're the ones that came up with that. So,
And obviously the laws around everything.
yes. So in certain ways, yes, they were extremely sophisticated. And of course, the biggest thing about people in the ancient world and today is that they weren't stupider than us. I mean, it's not this assumption, oh, well, in the ancient world, they just weren't as smart or something. No. They were fully as intelligent as we were. They didn't have access to the same technology as we do, but that doesn't mean they were any less smart.
Can we talk about the crisis of the 3rd century and the aforementioned Western and Eastern Roman empires, how it split?
Yeah, so, I mean, after Rome starts to go downhill, as you enter the 3rd century, so the 200s, so we're moving out of the Golden Era now. I mean, a famous Roman historian, Cassius Dio, who lived right at that moment, very famously wrote, of the transition of Marcus Aurelius to what follows, our kingdom now descends from one of gold to one of rust and iron. So even people who were alive at the time had a distinct sense something is going downhill here. And that's interesting because, you know, usually great historical moments are retroactive. And I mean, here's a guy who said, oh, something's going wrong. Something's really going badly now. And a lot of it becomes that the secret is out. That what makes an emperor is who commands the most swords. And so you start to get rebellions by various Roman generals, each declaring himself emperor. So you'd always had this to a certain degree, but they had kept it in check during the 2nd century AD. But in the 3rd century, you sometimes get 3 or 4 generals in different parts of the empire all declaring themselves emperor, and then they all rush off to Rome to fight a multi-way civil war. And of course, while they're doing this, the borders are undefended, so barbarians start to see opportunity and come across and start raiding. They start burning and pillaging farms. The civil wars are destroying cities and farms, so the economy is kind of tanking. Then there's less money coming in as taxes, so when one guy finally wins, he jacks up the tax rate to try and make up for it, but now there's fewer people able to pay, and it's all just a vicious cycle. The Romans start to debase the coinage, which means, you know, you take in a gold coin, You melt it down, mix it in with 10% something less valuable, and then stamp it and say it's worth the same.
Yeah.
Well, people aren't stupid. They're going to know that's only 90% of that gold
They've
coin.
invented inflation.
And you get horrific inflation uncontrolled. So the economy goes downhill. Barbarians are raiding. You have internal instability. In 1 year, you have something like 8 or 9 different guys go through as emperor in 238. So it's a mess. And it looks like the Roman Empire is going to fall in around the mid 3rd century. So this is the crisis. And then the kind of shocking development is late in that 3rd century, they actually stabilize the empire. So you have a series of these kind of army emperors who are just good generals who manage to push the barbarians out, reestablish the borders. It's actually a whole group of them, but often they get clumped under the most successful, the last guy, who's Diocletian, who comes in, and he tries to stabilize the economy. One of the things he does is he issues a new solid gold coin that he guarantees is solid gold, and he calls it a solidus, a solid coin. He famously issues a price edict where he says this is the maximum it's legal to charge for any good or service. So it's an attempt to curb inflation. And that's not gonna work, but it helps. Kind of amusingly, on Diocletian's price edict, can you guess what the most expensive sort of item is? Hiring a lawyer. So some things never change, right?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, in that system, there's probably a huge amount of lawyers.
Yeah, I mean, even lawyer isn't quite the right word. Romans didn't have true lawyers, but they had people you would hire to do legal stuff or give you legal advice. But anyway. No, the price edict is really fascinating because it's this long list of stuff, and you can see, a good pair of shoes, a bad pair of shoes, how much each costs, and you can see the relative value of things. So, what was food versus clothing? What was, going to the barber versus hiring a doctor, all that kind of stuff. So it's a really fun document to just mess around with. But anyway, so Diocletian stabilizes basically the empire and these other guys as well and gives it a new lease on life. So it seems by the end of the 3rd century that Rome is going to continue. And then as we go into the 4th century, you have the really dramatic thing where Constantine comes along and converts to Christianity. And at the time he converts, the percentage of Christians in the empire is small, 10% at most, something like that. Who knows? But it's quite small. And all of a sudden you have this weird thing where now the emperor belongs to this new religion. What does this mean? You can debate a lot how sincere Constantine's conversion was. It's a little bit of a weird thing where he clearly is using it as a way to fire up the troops before a crucial battle to say, hey, I just had this dream and this god promised us victory if we put his magic symbol on our shields. And this would be okay, except that he had done this a couple times before. So one time it was Helios, the sun god. One time it was another god. Even after he converts, he continues to mint coins and stuff with other gods on them. He continues to worship other gods. But he also kind of seems sincere in his conversion. It's just, I think the question is, how much does he understand his new religion? Maybe more than is it sincere? But that's a real turning point. So now as we go into the 4th century, we have this thing with Constantine, the new religion, and the other thing that happens is the empire is really just too big to govern effectively. It's that thing we're talking about. It's too large, the communication is too slow, and it starts to naturally fragment. And at times they try systems where they split it into 4. So under Diocletian he tries the tetrarchy, where he splits the empire into 4, and you actually have sort of 4 emperors working together as a team. More commonly it just splits east-west. So from that point on, you really start to have the history of the Western Empire going in one direction, the Eastern Empire in the other. You tend to have disabled. 2 emperors, though there are moments occasionally where they reunite. So that's a big development as well, and that's a
docking permission
point.
Requested. Docking request
accepted. So the most
accepted.
common date that people say, maybe you can correct me on this, that the Roman Empire fell is 476 AD. They're referring to the fall, quote unquote, of the Western Roman Empire. So why did the Roman Empire fall?
Yeah, this is a real game. Pick your favorite date for the fall of the Roman Empire. 476 is a very common one. And what happens in that year is a barbarian king comes down into Italy and
Okay, guys, it has been 10 hours, and I've been going a little bit less these days because I've been getting up and just walking and stuff and trying to work on my body more. And this leaves me a little bit more physically drained than normal, and while I adapt to that, and also I don't have any, I have not been using any caffeine the last couple of days, so I don't really have some like stimulant to like keep me up or anything. So I'm fairly tired. I am going to go to sleep, and I just want to say thank you. I'm going to log off the various games here. Got a lot done on New World, and I'm enjoying New World, and I'm actually very happy. New World is the game I've been looking for. They finally fixed the frame rate and the optimization, which was my main excuse me, which was my main complaint with the game. Excuse me. Uh, and yeah, and I'm really enjoying this. I mean, look how beautiful that is. Like, I think my faith is definitely placed well, and it's managing to keep its hold on me. I think it's a really good game, and the fresh start provides a really good opportunity. So, enjoying the hell out of New World. Before I go, I will log on to 76 and do my daily. I think I can even do that in Lotro too. I am paying for Lotro. I could log on and do the daily. Do my dailies on other MMOs and stuff. I own Embers Adrift, which is an interesting game. Give it 5 more minutes here while I just close out and do daily stuff since I'm paying monthlies. Oh, I didn't. Oops. Oh, good. Yes, I was gonna log in, Lotro, and as well as 76, but it crashed. There we go. And now, sorry, I'm just doing logins and stuff. Oh yeah, it's double score. I forgot about that. Hey, a free supply package though. It was good. This load is taking a long fucking time. Oh, there we go. Basic supplies, 50 virtue XP. Very good. Oh yeah, I got that nice necklace, huh? There it is. I like that game, but I think it should die. I think it's too old. I think it's too antiquated. I think it's a great game for people who really want to live the Lotro lore and have a community and all that. But I need a modern rendition of that, honestly. Copper ore, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to bed. But before I do, I'm just going to say, there we go. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired. I am skycat.live. I'm a bit tired because I've been walking 2 hours every single day for like 10 days, and that's like 20 hours in 2 weeks or whatever it's been, and or 10 days, and like that's a lot, and it's like wearing like the skin on the back of my heels like bad and stuff, is because I'm walking too much, and it's kind of wiped me out. Or I would do longer sessions. So anyways, I am skycat.live. I'm a full-time variety gamer all day, every day. Put me on in the background. I want to say thank you to everybody who gave me likes, subs, or follows yesterday or today or any time. Thank you for all of the support and everything. And that's full-time variety gamer all day, every day. Put me on the background. Click on the cat's face to donate. That's a PayPal link. Or come to my Twitch and give me a like, sub, or follow. Come to my YouTube and give me a check out my thousands of videos. And just a reminder, this 10 hour and 20-minute session was recorded and will be placed on my channel, on my YouTube channel, where there is thousands of videos. You can see this here. Oh, sorry, channel content. And yeah, we're doing pretty well. Just like go through and like take a look and stuff, and you know, doing pretty well. Thank you so much for your time, guys. I really enjoy being here, and thank you for your time. And yeah, and that's all I have for you. And you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you later. Love you. Bye.